Imagine a vast emerald archipelago, dismissed by the colonial elite as a cultural vacuum, a place where history supposedly began only when the first European keel scraped against its sandy shores. For decades, a prominent British historian championed this narrative, lecturing from wood panel halls that the pre-colonial Philippines was a land of primitive tribes with no unified soul, no written legacy, and certainly no art worth the world's attention. He claimed they were a people without a past, drifting in a permanent state of cultural infancy. But deep beneath the red clay of Surigao, a different story was waiting to be told. A story cast in shimmering, 24-karat defiance. This is a tale of how a single, accidental discovery of ancient gold didn't just glitter. It roared, shattering a century of academic arrogance and revealing a lost empire of sophisticated masters who had been trading with the world while Europe was still in the Dark Ages. The year was 1981, and the humid air of Surigao del Surhong, heavy over a landscape undergoing massive transformation. Berto Morales, a humble bulldozer operator working on a government irrigation project, had no interest in rewriting history books or challenging the grand narratives of British academia. To Berto, the earth was simply something to be moved, a barrier between the present and a more modern future for his village. As a heavy steel blade of his machine bit deep into a muddy embankment near the Hinatuan River, it struck something that didn't sound like stone or wood. There was a dull, metallic thud, followed by a glimmer that caught the harsh tropical sun, a flash of yellow so intense it seemed to vibrate against the dark, wet soil. What Berto unearthed in that single scoop was not just a hoard of metal, but a physical rebuke to every historian who had ever claimed the Philippines lacked a sophisticated pre-colonial civilization. He climbed down from his cab to find the mud littered with heavy chains, intricate waistbands, and armlets that looked as though they had been woven from silk rather than forged from heavy gold. These weren't crude trinkets. They were masterpieces of goldsmithing, featuring delicate filigree and symmetrical patterns that suggested a deep understanding of geometry and metallurgy. Berto stood frozen, holding a sash made of solid gold that weighed several kilograms, realizing in that silent moment that the primitive ancestors described in his school books were, in reality, masters in opulent, wealthy, and highly organized society. Word of the discovery spread like wildfire through the local barrios and eventually reached the ears of Dr. Alastair Finch, a fictional but representative British historian based in Hong Kong. Finch was a man of the old guard, a scholar who had built his entire career on the tabula rasa theory of Southeast Asia. He argued that before the arrival of the Spanish in 1521, the Philippine Islands were home only to disparate, nomadic groups with no central authority or high culture. To Finch, culture meant stone temples and written epics. Since the Philippines had little of the former and its bamboo scripts had mostly rotted away, he concluded there was nothing of value to find. He viewed the rumors of the Surigao Gold as likely exaggerations or, at best, evidence of Chinese trade goods dropped by passing merchants. Driven by a mix of skepticism and professional duty, Finch traveled to the Philippines to inspect the Surigao treasure for himself. He arrived at the central bank in Manila, where the items had been hurriedly secured, expecting to find a few simple rings or perhaps some gold dust. Instead, he was led into a vault that felt like stepping into sun. Before him lay the Kamagiai, a massive gold chain of such complexity that modern jewelers would struggle to replicate it. Each link was a tiny, interlocking masterpiece, woven together to create a flexible, shimmering rope of gold. Finch adjusted his spectacles, his hands trembling slightly as he realized these weren't imports from India or China. The stylistic motifs, the lotus flowers and the specific braiding techniques, were distinctly local, evolved over centuries of indigenous craftsmanship. The sheer volume of the gold was staggering, totaling over 30 kilograms of high-purity treasure from just one site. Finch spent hours examining a ceremonial waist cord, a solid gold belt featuring a buckle so intricate it looked like a celestial map. As a historian, he knew that gold of this purity and quantity could only belong to a datu or a raja of immense power. This implied a stratified society, a complex economy, and a legal system capable of protecting such wealth. His theory of a cultureless archipelago was crumbling under the weight of the very metal he was holding. If these people were as primitive as he had claimed, how did they possess the chemical knowledge to refine gold to 22 or 24 carats without modern laboratories? Finch's internal struggle mirrored the broader shift in Southeast Asian archaeology. For too long, the Eurocentric lens had filtered out the achievement of island nations, assuming that any sign of greatness must have been borrowed from elsewhere. However, the Surigao Gold proved that by the 10th century, the Philippines was a vital hub in the Maritime Silk Road. These artisans weren't just mimicking neighbors. They were innovators. The British historian sat in his hotel room that night, looking over his old lecture notes with a sense of profound shame. He had called them people without history. Yet here was a golden history, so bright it was blinding. The silence of the past wasn't due to a lack of culture, but a lack of listening on the part of the colonizers. The story of the gold also revealed a spiritual depth Finch had never considered. Among the finds were upavitas, or sacred threads, usually associated with high-ranking nobility in Hindu-Buddhist traditions. This indicated that the pre-colonial Filipinos were part of a vast, cosmopolitan religious network that stretched from the Indonesian Majapahit Empire to the Indian subcontinent. They were not isolated. They were global citizens of the medieval world. The gold wasn't just currency. It was a language of status, spirituality, and identity. Each granulated bead and hammered plate told a story of a people who celebrated beauty as much as they did power, defying the image of the savage that had been curated in Western textbooks for centuries. As Finch prepared his final report, he realized that the discovery wasn't just Berto Morales finding gold in the mud. It was the world discovering the soul of a nation. The British historian eventually published a public retraction of his earlier theories, titled The Golden Rajahnates. He confessed that his previous work had been blinded by a lack of physical evidence, failing to account for the fact that a tropical environment swallows wood and cloth, leaving only gold to testify for the dead. The Surigao treasure became the cornerstone of Filipino national pride, a tangible link to a golden age that was once thought to be a myth. It proved that before the cross and the sword arrived, there was already a crown, and it was made of the purest gold. The legacy of Berto's find continues to resonate today in the halls of the National Museum in Manila. Visitors stand in awe before the Surigao treasure, seeing their own reflections in the polished surfaces of a 1,000-year-old heritage. For the ghosts of Alastair Finch and the scholars who followed, the lesson was clear. History is not only written by the victors or the literate. It is often buried, waiting for the right moment to rise and reclaim its place. The Philippines was never a cultural vacuum. It was a hidden treasury, guarded by the earth until the world was finally humble enough to appreciate its brilliance. The gold didn't just change the history books. It restored a stolen identity to millions of people. In the end, the gold of Surigao serves as a permanent reminder that silence in a historical record is not evidence of absence. It is often a sign of a narrative that has been suppressed or ignored. The British historian who once looked down upon the archipelago from his ivory tower died a changed man, having learned that the most profound cultures are often those that don't shout to be heard. They wait in the soil, in the rivers, and in the blood of their descendants, ready to shine when the light of truth finally hits them. The primitive tribes were actually princes, and their story, once lost in the shadows of colonialism, is now forever etched in gold. As the news of the Surigao discovery permeated the academic world, the focus shifted from the gold's monetary value to the technical prowess required to create it. Experts in metallurgy were baffled by the granulation technique found on many of the earrings and necklaces. This process involves soldering tiny spheres of gold onto a surface to create complex patterns, a feat that requires precise temperature control that many thought impossible for the era. If the pre-colonial Filipinos were merely tribal, as the British historian had claimed, where were their massive furnaces? The reality was more subtle. They utilized small, highly efficient clay crucibles and blowpipes, demonstrating a mastery over fire that allowed for microscopic precision. Finch's journey didn't end in the vaults of Manila. He felt compelled to visit the site of the discovery in Surigao. Standing by the riverbanks where Berto Morales had struck gold, he saw the landscape through new eyes. He realized that the proximity to the sea made this region a natural gateway for trade. The gold wasn't just mined locally. It was likely a medium of exchange for spices, ceramics, and silk. The local Bukidnon culture was clearly a maritime powerhouse. He began to piece together a map of ancient trade routes that linked these islands to the great empires of Srivijaya and Kampa, positioning the Philippines as a central player in the medieval global economy. The social implications of the gold were equally revolutionary for Finch's research. In his earlier books, he had argued that pre-colonial society was chaotic and lacked leadership. However, the Surigao sash, a massive gold belt weighing nearly 4 kilograms, suggested a highly formalized system of royalty. Only a leader with significant territorial control and a stable workforce could commission such a piece. This wasn't the jewelry of a nomad. It was the regalia of a sovereign. It pointed toward the existence of polities, sophisticated city-states with their own laws, customs, and diplomatic relations. The historian had to admit that the anarchy he described was actually a complex, decentralized democracy of interconnected kingdoms. The symbolism etched into gold also spoke of a rich, indigenous mythology that had been largely overlooked. Finch noticed recurring motifs of the Naga, or mythical serpent, and the Garuda, a divine bird-like creature. These symbols were integrated with local flora and fauna designs, creating a unique Filipino aesthetic that was distinct from its neighbors. This fusion of international religious symbols with local artistry proved that the people were not just passive recipients of foreign culture. They were active editors, taking what they liked from the world and molding it into something that reflected their own island identity, a process scholars now call localization or indigenous creative adaptation. As Finch delved deeper, he discovered that the gold was often buried with the dead, a practice that pointed to a profound belief in the afterlife. The death masks found in other sites, though not part of the Surigao hoard itself, complemented the narrative of a culture that viewed gold as a protective skin for the soul. To the ancient Filipinos, gold was not just wealth. It was light made solid. It was used to cover the eyes, nose, and mouth of the deceased to prevent evil spirits from entering the body. This spiritual sophistication was a far cry from the heathen superstition Finch had once written about in his disparaging colonial-era essays. The discovery also forced a re-evaluation of the role of women in pre-colonial society. Many of the gold ornaments, including heavy earplugs and delicate rings, were designed for both men and women of high status. This suggested a more egalitarian social structure than the one imposed later by European patriarchy. Historical records and oral traditions started to make more sense to Finch. He began to read about the Babaylan, or female shamans, who held immense power in these gold-rich societies. The gold served as their ritual armor, a way to channel the divine. The British historians' old worldview, built on European hierarchies, simply didn't apply to this fluid, golden civilization. The impact on the Filipino people was perhaps the most significant outcome of the find. For generations, they had been told their history was a blank slate before 1521. The gold provided a smoking gun of evidence that they could hold up to the world. It wasn't just a matter of pride. It was a matter of psychological decolonization. Schools began to update their curricula, moving away from the discovery of the Philippines narrative toward a recovery of Philippine heritage. Berto Morales, the man who started it all, became a folk hero, though he remained a modest laborer, unaware that his bulldozer had crushed the foundations of colonial lies. Finch spent his final years as an advocate for the return of Philippine artifacts scattered in museums across the globe. He used his influence in the British academic circles to argue that the Surigao Gold was just the tip of the iceberg. He theorized that many more golden kingdoms lay hidden beneath the volcanic soil of the islands. His transformation from a critic to a champion of Filipino culture was viewed with suspicion by some of his peers. But the evidence was irrefutable. You could argue with theory, but you couldn't argue with 30 kilograms of 10th century gold. He had been proven wrong by the very earth he dismissed. The story of the British historian and the gold serves as a cautionary tale for all who study the past. It warns against the arrogance of the present, the idea that because we don't see evidence of a culture today, it must never have existed. The Philippines' history was written in gold, but it was also written in the resilience of its people. The treasure was a bridge across time, connecting the modern citizen to an ancestor who was a master of fire, a navigator of the stars, and a jeweler to the gods. The gold didn't need to be found to be real. It only needed to be seen. As the sun sets over the Hinatuan River today, the water still reflects a golden hue, reminding locals of the secrets held within the mud. The irrigation project Berto worked on is long finished, but the irrigation of the Filipino mind with the truth of its own greatness continues. The Surigao treasure remains the most significant archaeological find in the country's history, a silent but shimmering witness to a time when the islands were the center of a brilliant, sun-drenched world. The British historian's claim was finally laid to rest, buried under the weight of a truth that could never be tarnished by time or prejudice. Beyond the museum glass, the Surigao Gold continues to inspire a new generation of Filipino artists and designers. Modern jewelers now study the kamagiai chains to reclaim the techniques that were almost lost time. They see the gold not as a relic of a dead past, but as a living DNA of creativity. By replicating the patterns of their ancestors, they are weaving the broken threads of history back together. This resurgence of pre-colonial chic in Manila's fashion scene is a testament to the gold's enduring power. It is no longer just a treasure. It is a blueprint for a future built on authentic identity. The international community also had to adjust its understanding of the Silk Road. For too long, the narrative was focused on overland routes through Central Asia. The Surigao Gold helped popularize the concept of the Maritime Silk Road, a web of sea lanes that were just as vital and twice as dangerous. The Philippine archipelago was a primary stop on this route, a place where traders from as far as the Middle East would swap glassware for gold and pearls. The historian Alastair Finch's later maps reflected this, showing the islands as a glowing lantern in the middle of a vast, interconnected oceanic trade network. Archaeologists today continue to use the Surigao find as a reference point for new excavations across Southeast Asia. Every time a gold bead is found in Indonesia or a similar earring appears in Vietnam, researchers look to the Philippines for comparison. The Surigao style has become a recognized category in Asian art history, noted for its heavy use of solid gold and its rejection of hollow core casting. This distinction highlights the sheer abundance of gold in the pre-colonial Philippines. They didn't need to save material because the rivers were literally teeming with it. It was a land where gold was as common as clay. The environmental aspect of the find also offers a grim irony. The gold was preserved by the very mud and silt that modern development often destroys. As the Philippines faces the challenges of climate change and rapid urbanization, the race to find remaining heritage sites has become more urgent. The Surigao treasure was found by a bulldozer, but future discoveries will require the delicate brushes of trained professionals. The story of Berto Morales reminds us that history is often just a few inches beneath our feet, vulnerable to the same machines that build our modern world. Preservation is now a patriotic duty. Reflecting on the British historian's initial claims, it becomes clear that culture is often a matter of definition. If culture is defined by the ability to survive, thrive, and create beauty and harmony with the sea, then the pre-colonial Filipinos were among the most cultured people on earth. Their lack of stone cathedrals was a choice dictated by a landscape of earthquakes and typhoons, not a lack of vision. They built their cathedrals out of gold and wore them on their bodies. They carried their history with them, a portable and glittering legacy that could survive a shipwreck or a colonial invasion. The political impact of the gold cannot be understated. During times of national struggle, the image of the Surigao artifacts has been used to remind the people of their inherent strength. It serves as a rebuttal to the victim narrative that often dominates post-colonial history. The gold shows a people who were powerful, wealthy, and independent long before any foreign power arrived to civilize them. This psychological shift is essential for a nation still navigating its place in the modern world. The gold is a reminder that they were never discovered. They were merely met by others. Even the British academic establishment eventually came around to Finch's revised view. The British Museum and other institutions have since hosted exhibitions featuring Philippine gold, acknowledging its unique place in the global artistic canon. The gold of the ancestors is no longer a niche topic for regional specialists. It is taught as a primary example of high-level metallurgy in world history courses. The historian's initial errors serve as a catalyst for a global correction, proving that even the most established facts must be questioned when they are rooted in colonial bias or a lack of evidence. As we look back on the story of the Surigao treasure, we see a cycle of loss and recovery. The gold was buried to protect it from invaders, forgotten by a people forced to adopt new gods and languages, and then accidentally revealed to a world that had forgotten how to look. The journey of the gold from the river mud to the high-security vault is a metaphor for the Filipino spirit itself, often buried under layers of external influence, but always retaining its purity and brilliance underneath. It is a story of survival that is both physical and spiritual. In his final interview, the fictional Dr. Finch was asked what he would say to Berto Morales if they ever met again. He replied that he would simply thank him for being the man with the shovel who broke my ego. He realized that the bulldozer was a more honest tool than his pen had ever been. One moved the earth to find the truth. The other had used ink to hide it. The gold was the ultimate teacher, a silent instructor that taught the world that the Philippines was never nothing. It was, and always has been, a land of light and legacy. So, the next time you see a piece of ancient gold, remember that it is more than just a mineral. It is a time capsule, a piece of a puzzle that tells us who we are and where we came from. The British historian's claim was silenced not by an argument, but by the undeniable shine of a civilization that refused to stay buried. The Philippines' culture was never missing. It was just waiting for the right light to hit it. And now, that light, the golden light of Surigao, shines for all the world to see, a testament to a glorious past that can never be erased again. This is History Media. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you can be notified when more interesting stories of Philippines get on the channel.